What actually happened when slaves were freed? The end of slavery is often remembered as a brilliant moment of freedom when every chain was broken overnight. But was it really that simple? As news of emancipation reached southern plantations, former slaves faced not only joy but also fear, confusion, and incredibly difficult choices. Many assumed freedom meant everyone left right away, but in reality, a surprising number chose to stay. Today, let's uncover the complicated, unexpected, and deeply emotional truth of what actually happened in those first days of freedom. Delayed Freedom Day, the story beyond the books. You might recall images of Union soldiers marching into Galveston, Texas in 1865, bringing news of the end of the Civil War and specifically the abolition of slavery. It was a fateful day, combining June and the 19th, which became the commemoration day for the end of slavery in America. However, the story of this Freedom Day was neither simple nor simultaneous across the United States. In fact, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had been issued more than 2 years prior, precisely on January 1st, 1863. Yet, the enforcement of this proclamation in Texas faced immense difficulties because the Union at that time had no significant military presence in the state. Texas was one of the last Confederate states to be reached by Union troops, causing the news of freedom to be significantly delayed. Regarding the reasons for this delay, historians hold different views. Some believe it was primarily due to the poor communication systems of the time, which prevented news from spreading quickly to remote areas. Meanwhile, other historians believe that Texas slaveholders deliberately withheld the information, not wanting their enslaved people to know they had been freed, in order to maintain free labor for as long as possible. It was not until June 19, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger, along with Union soldiers, finally arrived in Galveston, Texas, that the news of freedom was truly announced. Major General Granger proclaimed General Order No. 3, a statement of profound historical significance. This proclamation explicitly stated, "The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The order also advised the freed people to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages, noting that they would not be allowed to collect at military posts and would not be supported in idleness there or elsewhere. On that very day, approximately 250,000 enslaved people were freed. However, despite the message advising them to stay home and work for their former owners, most former slaves immediately left Texas. They traveled north or to neighboring states to find relatives from whom they had been separated to reunite with their families. When the news arrived, the complexity of freedom. When the news of freedom finally reached plantations and farms, the reactions of freed people and their former owners were incredibly diverse and complex, with no single common script. The lives of those who were freed opened a new chapter full of surprises and challenges. The unexpected stay. Not all freed slaves left immediately. Booker T. Washington, one of the most prominent figures in the African American community, recounted in his autobiography that many formerly enslaved people, especially the elderly, decided to stay on the old plantation. On the very first day of freedom, Washington noted that, one by one, and in a way that was first secretive, the older slaves began to leave the slave quarters and make their way back to the Great House for a whispered conversation with their former owners about the future. Although free, these individuals often reached agreements with their former owners to work for wages. Thomas Rutling was a similar case. He was only 9 years old when he heard the news of emancipation on a plantation in Wilson County, Tennessee. Rutling naively thought that freedom meant his family would live a life like his former owners, with horses and everything. But instead, his family chose to stay on the plantation for another 2 years. It wasn't until 1865 that Rutling, along with his brother and sister, left the plantation for Nashville, where he later studied at the Fisk Free Colored School, the precursor to the prestigious Fisk University. Immediate departure. In contrast to those who chose to stay, many others decided to leave immediately. The decision to leave or stay often depended on the individual's age and health. Annie L. Burton recounts in her book Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, 1909, that when the news reached the Alabama plantation in April 1865, every slave who was not sick or disabled left immediately. Some younger, healthier individuals even quickly joined the Union Army to continue the fight for freedom. Annie and her younger sisters remained under the care of their mistress because their mother had run away. Notably, Annie's mistress even tried to persuade her husband not to tell the slaves about their freedom, and force the sick and disabled slaves to stay and work in the fields after the crops were planted. Freed slaves reported that those who remained were often the oldest and most loyal. Plantation owners' efforts to retain former slaves. Facing the mass exodus of their labor force, many plantation owners tried every possible way to retain their former slaves. Some required them to sign contracts committing to work until the following January, with wages to be distributed at the fall harvest. In Irving E. Lowry's book Life on the Old Plantation in Antebellum Days, 1911, he tells of an owner who gave a long speech to persuade his former slaves. The owner reminded them that he was not a bad man, had never put an overseer over them, never used hounds, and never separated mother from child or husband from wife. He also said that they were welcome to stay on his plantation as long as they wished. Although that argument seems weak and unconvincing to us today, what's astonishing is that all but one signed the contract. They used a simple gesture, lining up to touch a pen to the paper instead of signing, because most of them were illiterate. Henry Clay Bruce, another former slave, revealed in his memoir, The New Man, 29 years a slave, 29 years a free man, 1895, that the relationship between former masters and former slaves at the time of emancipation was sometimes truly pathetic. Bruce's former master pleaded with them not to leave and used every persuasive means possible. He even issued freedom passes to each adult and promised to pay Bruce $15 a month along with food and clothing if he stayed to work on the farm. Bruce accepted this offer effective January 1st, 1864. However, by March of that year, he realized the agreement could not be fulfilled and decided to leave for Kansas. He recounted that he did not have the courage to tell his master he was leaving. Years later, Bruce still visited and sent letters to inquire about the old farm situation, learning of increasingly poor conditions, including stories of stolen horses and food. This story illustrates the difficulty and complexity of establishing a fair labor relationship after centuries of exploitation. Sometimes the reactions of slave owners were even more extreme. Sam and Louisa Everett told interviewer Pearl Randolph in 1936 about the behavior of their former owner, Big Jim McLean in Norfolk, Virginia. When Big Jim heard the news that slaves were free, he stood crying on his porch, cursing the fate that had taken all his slaves. When none of them agreed to stay to harvest the crops, he flew into a rage, pulled out a gun, and began shooting into the frightened crowd of black people. Some were killed on the spot, others permanently injured. Eventually, he was persuaded to stop and even tried to commit suicide. A few frightened slaves promised to stay with him for another year, which appeased him. It was not until Union soldiers intervened again that Big Jim allowed the former slaves to leave. But there were also strange, even tragicomic stories. Charles Hayes, a Kentucky plantation owner, initially also hid the news of emancipation from his slaves. However, fearing arrest, he reluctantly announced it. Former slave Harry Smith recounted that Hayes said, "I'm about to tell you something I never expected to say in my life. That is, all of you, women, men, and children belonging to me, you are free to go wherever you want." At the same time, Hayes cursed Lincoln and wanted to kill him for taking his slaves. However, after calming down, Hayes opened the liquor cellar and hosted a lavish party described as a grand celebration. Harry Smith recalled, "The old master got drunk and retired to his room. His daughter, a young woman never known to drink, became intoxicated. Everyone cheered for Abraham Lincoln, while the old master was too drunk to notice. An old enslaved woman named Aunt Bess, who was very religious and looked after the children, drank too much liquor and, to show her joy, sang old songs, which further enlivened the ceremony." In the evening, everyone started dancing and continued until the next morning. These initial reactions show that there was no single script for freedom. Each person, each plantation, was a unique story, a unique moment in history. If you were a newly freed slave, what would be your first choice? Stay and work, or leave immediately to seek a new life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The burden of freedom, personal choices, and new hopes. Once the initial joy subsided, many former slaves began to feel anxious about the true meaning of freedom. Free life was not just joy, but also a heavy burden of responsibility, a daily struggle with new challenges. Emotional reaction and anxiety. At the Virginia plantation where Booker T. Washington was born, the first day of freedom began with a simple but solemn meeting. Then, a government official read the Emancipation Proclamation, and the initial news was well received. Washington recalled his former owner's family being sad, not because of property loss, but because they had great attachment to some of their former slaves. His mother kissed her children while tears of joy streamed down her cheeks. He recounted there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but no bitterness. There was even pity from the slaves toward their former owners. However, the initial joy lasted only for a short time. Washington observed that when they returned to their cabins, a change in emotion took place. The great responsibility of being free, of fending for themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to overwhelm them. For some, freedom was indeed much more serious than they had expected. Notably, Washington pointed out that some slaves were 70 or 80 years old and had no strength to earn a living in a strange place and among strangers. This was a psychological and practical burden that many freed people faced. Practical choices after freedom. In Samuel Spofford Clement's memoirs, Clement recounts how his former master Tasswood Ward announced the news of freedom on the morning of April 12, 1865, 3 days after General Lee's surrender. Ward and his wife came out, he holding a newspaper, she crying. Instead of addressing the enslaved people by their old names, Ward said, "You men and women, you are as free as the birds that fly in the sky." He raised the newspaper and read a summary that General Lee had surrendered to General Grant. The Confederacy was over, and all slaves were free. Ward then offered to pay them to stay and help harvest the crops. Everyone except a man named Uncle Fendel accepted. Uncle Fendel worried that the rebels might continue fighting and reclaim their freedom, which he had prayed his whole life to achieve. Another story comes from Thomas Almond Ashby, who witnessed his father announce the news of freedom to the enslaved people on their family plantation in Front Royal, Virginia. Ashby's father said he no longer had control over them, and in the future would pay for their services at community wages. He gave them the choice to stay and work for him or find a new home. He also warned about the changing conditions that freedom would bring and urged them to cultivate habits of frugality and industry to become useful and self-respecting citizens. It took several years before all the former slaves left. A woman named Aunt Susan followed this advice diligently. After 3 years of saving money from washing and light work, she bought a nice small house in the city. Aunt Susan's story is a powerful testament to the self-reliance and determination of newly freed people. From the stories of Booker T. Washington, Samuel Spofford, and Aunt Susan, we see that freedom was not just joy, but also a great burden of responsibility. It demanded adaptation, courage, and self-sufficiency. These authentic perspectives delve deeper than what we typically know about history. This was not a single event, but millions of individual events, millions of choices, each carrying hope and uncertainty. From the stories of Booker T. Washington, Samuel Spofford, and Aunt Susan, we see that freedom was not just joy, but also a great burden of responsibility. It demanded adaptation, courage, and self-sufficiency. These authentic perspectives delve deeper than what we typically know about history. Please hit like if you find these aspects of the Emancipation event interesting and thought-provoking. External intervention. In the complex context of the emancipation process, news of freedom was not always directly communicated by slave owners. Sometimes those who brought the news of freedom to remote areas were Union soldiers or officials, representing new power and new hope. Therefore, external intervention also played an important role in disseminating news of freedom to distant, secluded places. One of the important figures in spreading the news of freedom was James T. Ayers, a Union recruiter. Ayers was often the first to inform former slaves that they were free. In his diary on May 7, 1864, Ayers recorded a specific incident when he delivered the news of emancipation to 4 former slaves near Huntsville, Alabama. He did this by showing them a leaflet with an illustration of freed slaves on one side and a 2-sentence version of the Emancipation Proclamation on the other. Upon encountering the group of slaves, Ayers made a direct and powerful offer. "We want some help. The Union offers $10 a month and will give you clothes, food, and free you if you enlist and become a soldier. How many young men will join?" When the slaves asked when he wanted them to go and expressed that their masters would not allow it, Ayers responded with a decisive action. "Don't bother about your masters, you have no masters. I will see to it that your masters don't hinder you." After the 4 men agreed to enlist, Ayers told them to pack their belongings and promised to protect them. When confronted by their former owner, John Eldridge, and his family, Ayers stood firm. Eldridge asked, "What does all this mean? My slaves say you went into the field and freed them all. Is that so?" Ayers firmly replied, "Yes, sir." When Eldridge asked Ayers where he got his authority, Ayers affirmed, "From the War Department, sir, I got my authority. The best authority, isn't it?" The argument culminated when Ayers pulled his trusty pistol from its holster and told Eldridge, "I won't harm a hair on your head, sir, if you keep quiet. But I came for your Negroes, and your Negroes I will have." It is believed that Ayers recruited hundreds of black soldiers for the Union cause and spread the news of emancipation to thousands before he died of illness in September 1865. Ayers' diary also confirmed that Charles Hayes was not the only owner who tried to hide the news of emancipation from his slaves. This shows that the dissemination of freedom's news was often an information war, where slave owners tried every means to maintain control, and individuals like Ayers served as messengers of hope, sometimes resorting to force to ensure that freedom was enforced, the difficult path to true independence. Although slavery legally ended with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, the path to true equality was still very long. This was a period when freed people faced countless obstacles, a silent but arduous battle. One of the biggest challenges was that while the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, those born into slavery were not considered citizens. This meant they lacked fundamental and most important rights, including the right to own property and the right to vote. Therefore, initial efforts to transition from slavery to freedom prioritized securing citizenship for them. To support this process, Congress established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, on March 3, 1865. This agency aimed not only to assist freed people, but also to help reconstruct the political and social fabric of the Southern states after the war. To achieve this lofty goal, the Bureau provided food, clothing, medical care, and legal representation to the population. They also promoted education, helped legalize marriages, and assisted African American soldiers and sailors in receiving overdue pay, enlistment bounties, and pensions. These goods and services, along with the names of those provided, including millions of formerly enslaved people and hundreds of thousands of white Southerners, were carefully recorded by hand. These original records are preserved by the National Archives and Records Administration, including census lists, apprenticeship contracts, labor contracts, correspondence, and marriage and hospital registers, as well as names of individuals and the aid they received. Today, the NMAAHC's Freedmen's Bureau Search Portal provides a comprehensive online platform for family historians, genealogists, scholars, and students to research individuals and various topics within the Freedmen's Bureau records. These records serve as written evidence that these individuals lived, labored, married, and had children. They also provide deep insight into the lives of the newly freed and thereby offer meaningful context for the social conditions of the post-war South. However, the path from slavery to freedom was fraught with difficulties and obstacles. Although the Freedmen's Bureau prioritized helping freed people settle on abandoned or confiscated lands by promoting the contract labor system with the intent of replacing slavery, most of the land provided to African Americans for farming was in forested or swampy areas, unsuitable for cultivation. At the same time, African Americans in the South faced overt discrimination in important aspects of society. White doctors refused to treat black patients, and white Southern teachers disseminated anti-emancipation lessons, sowing hatred and division. Ultimately, due to lack of funding from Congress and strong opposition from President Andrew Johnson, the Freedmen's Bureau struggled to achieve many of the goals its representatives had set. As a result, the Bureau, which had established offices across 15 southern and border states as well as in D.C., only operated from 1865 to 1872. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded President Lincoln, spent his entire term trying to undo his predecessor's work. In particular, he opposed policies related to land distribution for freed people, which was Lincoln's promise of 40 acres and a mule. Johnson successfully helped plantation owners retain their land, leading to the failure of this crucial promise, leaving many newly freed African Americans without the opportunity to own land, a key factor in generational wealth creation. With the free slave labor gone, the Southern economy was severely devastated. Plantation owners devised a cunning plan, the sharecropping system. This system allowed them to continue exploiting newly freed black farmers by renting land in exchange for a very small portion of the crop. Black people who had been deprived of education during slavery had no skills other than agriculture, and the South offered no other jobs for them. Cornered, they had no choice but to accept these unfair terms. To counter the 14th Amendment, Southern states created what were called Black Codes, and later Jim Crow laws. These laws were designed to systematically discriminate against and segregate black people. For example, vagrancy laws allowed police to arrest any black citizen deemed unemployed, bring them to often unfair trial, and force them into hard labor, often for former plantation owners. These laws, though not directly calling it slavery, effectively maintained a similar form of labor exploitation. Despite facing significant opposition from post-war institutions and society, African Americans persistently fought for their rights. Education was one area where formerly enslaved people achieved significant initial success. Literacy was not just a skill, but a vital tool in the pursuit of citizenship and equality. It meant the ability to understand and draft labor contracts, to protect oneself against fraudulent and deceptive agreements. Even before the Freedmen's Bureau was established, many African Americans independently bought or rented land to build schools, while others contributed materials and labor to construct them. This is a testament to their burning desire for knowledge. During its operation, the Freedmen's Bureau played a crucial role in helping establish several historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, across the South, including famous institutions like Howard University, Fisk University, and Hampton University. Freedmen's schools were not just for children. Because learning to read and write was once illegal under slavery, most newly freed adults were also eager for education. Many Bureau schools offered classes during the day, evening, and even weekends for students of all ages. Although many teachers were white women associated with Northern aid societies, there was also a significant number of free and formerly enslaved African Americans from both the North and South who became teachers. The Freedmen's Bureau's education records provide a detailed look at the number of students in each class, the types of supplies and funding needed to build and operate schools, and the tireless efforts of teachers in educating their students. After hearing these stories, what makes you think most about this turbulent period of history? Leave your comments and help spread this message. From pain to pride, Juneteenth and a lasting legacy. Today, Juneteenth is not merely a holiday. It is a powerful reminder of the arduous, bloody, and tear-filled journey from bondage to freedom for millions of people. It is a living testament to the resilient will and indomitable spirit of a people who overcame countless difficulties to rise. Initially, Juneteenth, June 19, 1865, was primarily celebrated by the Black community as their own Independence Day. However, the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s rekindled widespread interest in Juneteenth festivities, bringing this day out of the African American community and spreading it across the country. Juneteenth became an official Texas state holiday on January 1, 1980, thanks to the tireless efforts of African American legislator Al Edwards. And in the 21st century, Juneteenth has become a widely recognized day to celebrate the great historical achievements of Black people, as well as to encourage respect and pride in all cultures. The legacy of this resilience is clearly evident in many aspects. The Freedmen's Bureau records, as we have learned, are living proof that these individuals lived, labored, married, and had children. They do not just paint a static portrait of a moment in history, but also provide meaningful context for the complex social conditions of the post-war South and the continuous struggle for freedom by African Americans into the next century. These records also reflect the intense determination of Black Americans under the most difficult circumstances, a powerful legacy reflected in the protests of the Civil Rights era and current efforts to achieve racial equity and social justice. Although the Southern economy was severely devastated after the Civil War, most descendants of plantation owners recovered wealth and prosperity within 2 decades. This was largely due to their continued exploitation of labor, albeit in new forms such as the sharecropping system. Former plantations were converted into real estate projects, tourist resorts, or other business ventures. But the stain of slavery remains very difficult to erase and still affects us today. Frederick Douglass, a great historical figure, called the Jubilee the celebrations when news of freedom arrived, one of the great events of the 19th century and a down payment on the redemption of the American soul. This shows the profound importance of these moments of liberation for the national consciousness. Despite living in extreme poverty in the 1930s, most interviewed former slaves stated that they lived better when no longer enslaved. This demonstrates the priceless value of freedom despite material hardships. A significant change and a symbol of freedom was that Black women no longer worked in the fields but focused on family and domestic work. This was a significant improvement in their living conditions and social status. Freed people moved extensively, not only to reunite with separated families, but also to escape abusive owners or to move to growing urban areas where there were more opportunities. Their eagerness to pursue education was widely documented. Schools funded by the Freedmen's Bureau and churches, even offering evening classes for adults, were full of students. African Americans understood that knowledge was the key to unlocking a better future, to truly being free and equal. The Library of Congress has audio recordings of interviews with former slaves still alive during the Great Depression, providing moving, authentic accounts of these moments. One man recounted kneeling and crying when Union soldiers arrived in his town. Juneteenth and the entire story of the abolition of slavery are not just the history of one group of people, but an indispensable part of the great story of America. It reminds us of past challenges, unfinished struggles, and legacies that we need to cherish, protect, and continue in the journey toward justice and equality. We learn that freedom is not a final destination, but a continuous journey that requires courage and determination from every individual and the entire community. Inside the most horrific slavery breeding farms of cotton plantations, beneath the surface of America's past lies a world where people were bought and sold like cattle, and families could vanish overnight. What forces built this brutal system, and who dared to fight against it? Stay with us as we reveal the hidden stories behind America's struggle with slavery and the quest for justice and freedom. The origins of slavery in America. With just a stroke of a pen, freedom could be stripped away and entire lives were uprooted overnight. Starting in the late 1400s, the transatlantic slave trade cast a shadow across history, one that would haunt millions. For more than 3 centuries, from 1525 to 1866, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were torn from their homes, herded onto ships, and forced to cross a merciless ocean. Only about 10.7 million survived the journey, their spirits battered but unbroken. The early 1600s brought this tragedy to North America's shores. In 1619, a ship quietly docked at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying around 20 enslaved Africans. It might have seemed like a small event at the time, a single tragic footnote. But in truth, this moment planted the seeds for a system of systematic cruelty that would shape America's future. As Ghanaian scholar Abena Busia once wrote, "The story of the African in the Americas begins with a river of tears and a trail of blood." These words echo through history, capturing the suffering, resilience, and fierce hope of millions. Why did such horror happen? The answer, as cold as it is simple, lies in profit. Colonists saw vast potential in the New World's fertile fields. Tobacco, cotton, and sugar all promised unimaginable riches. At first, they relied on indentured European servants, but demand quickly outstripped supply. Greed took over, and plantation owners began viewing Africans not as people, but as property, commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited in the endless pursuit of wealth, the expansion and entrenchment of slavery. As the 1700s dawned, slavery in America transformed from a collection of cruel practices into an organized, relentless machine. What once seemed like isolated acts of oppression was now a fully entrenched institution, with its grip tightening on both the land and its people. In 1705, Virginia, a colony founded on dreams of liberty, took a dark and fateful step. Lawmakers passed legislation that would echo for centuries. Slaves and their children would be enslaved for life, cementing the brutal concept of chattel slavery. In the eyes of the law, people were no longer just people. They were property, bought, sold, inherited, and treated as mere commodities. What fueled this shift? Two powerful forces were at play. The first was economics. The southern colonies were rapidly growing, and their prosperity hinged on labor-intensive crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and soon, cotton. The demand for cheap, controllable labor was insatiable. The second force was fear. As more and more Africans were forcibly brought to America, white colonists grew anxious about potential uprisings and their own grip on power. To maintain their dominance and protect their wealth, they wrote laws that kept enslaved people and their descendants in bondage forever. The hypocrisy of this system did not go unnoticed, even by those at the heart of America's founding. In 1773, Benjamin Franklin, one of the era's most respected thinkers, publicly questioned the logic of the British Empire. He highlighted how Britain could boast about offering freedom to enslaved people who landed on its shores, while simultaneously growing rich from the trade that kept millions in chains. His words expose the deep contradiction at the center of both British and American society, a commitment to liberty on paper, built atop a reality of suffering. But the roots of this system stretched back even further. As early as 1619, the first slave farms appeared in Jamestown, Virginia. What started as a small-scale experiment in forced labor would, over the course of the next century, grow into a vast and powerful engine that fueled the entire Southern economy. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, slavery was no longer just tolerated, it was essential. The daily lives and futures of enslaved men, women, and children were dictated by laws and customs designed to keep them subjugated forever. Then came a turning point that changed everything. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793. With this new machine, processing cotton became dramatically faster and easier. Suddenly, growing cotton was so profitable that plantation owners rushed to plant it everywhere they could. But this new white gold came at a devastating cost. The explosion of cotton farming in the South drove the demand for enslaved labor to staggering new heights. States like South Carolina saw their enslaved population soar as the region became the world's center for raw cotton production, feeding textile mills in the North and as far away as Britain. By the early 1800s, the institution of slavery had become deeply woven into every aspect of Southern society. Enslaved people weren't just workers, they were the backbone of the economy. They were listed on ledgers, used as collateral for loans, and passed down like family heirlooms. Their bodies, their futures, and their dignity were sacrificed on the altar of profit and greed. But the moral crisis could not be ignored forever. Voices like abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison's grew louder, demanding that America finally confront the true cost of its prosperity. In 1831, Garrison put the nation on notice. "We are going to decide whether the slave-holding, soul-driving system shall be continued." The country stood at a crossroads. Could a society that claimed to value liberty and equality continue to justify such cruelty? As the 19th century wore on, slave farms and plantations spread relentlessly across the South. The richest and most fertile regions along the Atlantic coast, through the Carolinas and Georgia, and hugging the Mississippi River, became the heartland of this system. By 1860, the census painted a stark, unsettling picture. Nearly 4 million people enslaved, the vast majority living and working on plantations. Their labor fueled the wealth and comfort of a nation, but their suffering was largely ignored by those in power. This deep entrenchment of slavery left scars that would take generations to heal, and forced America to face its own contradictions in the most painful ways imaginable. Shadows of the plantation, the harrowing reality of enslaved life. Imagine waking before dawn each day, knowing your fate was never your own. For millions of enslaved people across the American South, life under the shadow of the plantation was a relentless cycle of toil, deprivation, and fear. A world defined by brutality and the daily denial of humanity. As the sun rose over endless fields of cotton, sugar, or tobacco, the enslaved were already at work. Their days began in the darkness and often ended there too. Every hour was measured by the demands of their overseers. Work was grueling, the pace relentless. Men, women, and even children as young as 3 or 4 were expected to pick, chop, haul, or clean from sunup to sundown. In the cotton fields, hands were often raw and bleeding, as workers were forced to meet impossible quotas. Sometimes 200 pounds of cotton a day. Failure to keep up could mean violent punishment, the crack of the whip, or public humiliation in front of family and peers. These punishments were not rare. Overseers ruled with cruelty, using fear to control and break spirits. Frederick Douglass, who was enslaved as a child, recalled in his autobiography how the loudest cries only made overseers beat harder and longer. Moses Roper, who escaped slavery, described witnessing his own mother being beaten even as she gave birth. Her pain ignored, her pleas unanswered. Living conditions offered no refuge. Enslaved families were crowded into tiny, dilapidated cabins, often with dirt floors and leaky roofs. At plantations like Magnolia in South Carolina, as many as 10 people might share a space smaller than a modern bathroom. Privacy was non-existent. Everyone's life was on display and basic dignity was stripped away. There was little protection from the elements. Cold in winter, sweltering heat in summer, rain soaking through at night. Nutrition was barely enough to sustain the backbreaking labor. Food rations were meager, usually cornmeal, a bit of pork fat, and sometimes molasses. Vegetables or fresh meat were rare treats, and malnutrition was rampant. Solomon Northup, in his famous memoir, 12 Years a Slave, remembered receiving only a peck of corn and a few pounds of pork per week. This diet, lacking vital nutrients, left people weak and vulnerable to disease. Outbreaks of cholera, pneumonia, and other illnesses swept through the slave quarters, taking countless lives. Medical care was almost non-existent. When illness or injury struck, enslaved people were often left to suffer without treatment. Some, like Dr. J. Marion Sims, now infamous for his unethical practices, used enslaved people as unwilling subjects for medical experimentation, often without anesthesia. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person in the mid-19th centuries was just 21 years, a stark measure of both the physical and psychological toll. The psychological toll of slavery was deep and relentless, leaving scars that went far beyond the chains. One of the most haunting cruelties was the routine separation of families. Children could be torn from their mother's arms and sold off like livestock. Their cries for comfort ignored, their futures decided in an instant by the highest bidder. Parents were left in anguish, powerless to protect the ones they loved most, forced to live with an ache that never faded. The suffering did not stop there. Enslaved women were especially vulnerable to abuse. The harrowing story of Celia, a young woman forced to defend herself against the relentless sexual assaults of her owner, shows the daily terrors many endured. When Celia fought back, killing her abuser in self-defense, she was not granted mercy or justice. Instead, she was executed, a stark reminder of just how little protection or dignity was afforded to the enslaved, especially women. Former slave William Wells Brown captured the emotional devastation with chilling clarity. "Slavery has fixed a deep gulf, a dark abyss," he wrote, "a chasm of pain, trauma, and loss that separated enslaved people from the rest of humanity." This abyss was filled with grief, broken families, stolen childhoods, and the constant threat of violence and exploitation. It was a darkness that touched every life, casting a shadow that would stretch far beyond the plantation and linger for generations. Did any part of this history change the way you see America's past? Tell us what stood out to you in the comments. Sparks of defiance, resistance, and rebellion. Even under the constant threat of violence and heartbreak, the human spirit among the enslaved was not broken. In the dim glow of the slave quarters, whispers of resistance moved like a secret wind, quiet but unstoppable. No matter how hard the system tried to crush hope, a longing for freedom and dignity always burned. For every chain and every act of cruelty, there was a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to surrender one's sense of self. Some acts of defiance were subtle, almost invisible to the eyes of overseers. Many enslaved people staged work slowdowns, feigned illness, or deliberately broke tools. These small, everyday disruptions chipped away at the plantation's productivity and frustrated those who claimed ownership over other human beings. Songs became a powerful tool of resistance as well. Frederick Douglass described how spirituals and work songs were more than music. They carried secret messages, plans, and dreams. The act of singing itself was defiant, a reminder that enslaved people still owned their voices and their dreams, even when they owned nothing else. Cultural traditions held strong as well. On the Sea Islands, the shout, a rhythmic call-and-response song and dance, allowed people to express solidarity, pass covert messages, and nurture their African heritage. Through music, dance, and faith, enslaved people created a hidden world of connection and support, right under the noses of those who would deny their humanity. But resistance did not stop at subtle sabotage. Many were willing to risk everything to pursue freedom. The most famous example was the Underground Railroad, a vast, secret network of safe houses and allies stretching from the Deep South to the Free North. Harriet Tubman became the legend of this movement, a woman who escaped slavery herself, then returned again and again, leading at least 70 people to freedom. Tubman's courage was matched by her conviction. "I had reasoned. There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death." Her example inspired others to believe that freedom was possible no matter the odds. William Still, a free black man in Philadelphia, worked tirelessly to help those escaping bondage, recording the names and stories of over 800 men, women, and children who passed through his care. He later wrote, "The heroism should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations, honoring the bravery of those who risked everything to break their chains." Rebellion was not limited to escape or sabotage. Sometimes it exploded into open revolt. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion shook South Carolina, as dozens of enslaved Africans seized weapons and struck back, killing slaveholders and marching for freedom. Though ultimately crushed, the rebellion sent shockwaves through the white population and sparked new, harsh laws meant to stamp out future uprisings. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 became one of the most famous insurrections in American history. Turner, an enslaved preacher, gathered around 70 followers and launched a bloody attack that left dozens dead. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Many were executed, and laws became even more draconian. But the fear among slaveholders was unmistakable. The enslaved were never truly powerless. Before his death, Turner declared, "I am loaded with chains, but this is nothing compared to how I have been bound by my fellow creatures," speaking to the psychic pain of bondage that no physical restraint could contain. The German Coast Uprising of 1811, led by Charles de Landais near New Orleans, was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Armed with sugarcane knives and sheer determination, as many as 500 enslaved people marched, burning plantations and demanding recognition as men, not beasts. Though violently suppressed, their bold cry, "We will show these whites that we are men, not beasts of burden," echoed through history. Women played a vital role too as leaders and visionaries. Maria Stewart, a free black woman and abolitionist, rallied black women to rise up, declaring, "O ye daughters of Africa, awake! Show forth that you are endowed with noble faculties." Her voice and the courage of women like her galvanized a new generation to demand their rightful place in the fight for liberation. Despite the ever-present danger of retaliation, the flame of resistance never went out. William Wells Brown, once enslaved and later a prominent abolitionist, said it best. "The slave is a thing, a marketable commodity, and yet he is a man." Through rebellion, large and small, enslaved people insisted on their humanity, their dignity, and their right to freedom, no matter how dark the night. Which acts of resistance by enslaved people do you find the most powerful or inspiring, and why? Slavery's central role in America's rise. To truly understand America's emergence as a global economic powerhouse, you have to look beneath the surface, to the fields, the plantations, and the lives of millions who toiled there. Slavery wasn't just an ugly footnote in American history, it was the engine that powered the nation's rise. The rhythmic clang of hammers in the blacksmith shop, the creak of overloaded wagons, and the mournful songs drifting through the fields, these were the true sounds of American progress in the 18th and 19th centuries. By the time of the American Revolution, enslaved people already formed a crucial part of the population, especially in the South. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar weren't just valuable crops, they were cornerstones of an economy built almost entirely on forced labor. As the years went on, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 would supercharge the demand for cotton, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor. What became known as King Cotton quickly dominated the landscape and the balance sheets of Southern planters, whose wealth skyrocketed on the backs of those forced to work their land. By 1860, enslaved people represented nearly 13% of the total U.S. population, almost 4 million souls, the vast majority concentrated in the plantation states of the South. The value of enslaved people as property was estimated at an astronomical $3.5 billion, making them the single most valuable asset in the country, worth more than all the nation's banks, railroads, and factories combined. Cotton alone accounted for over half of all U.S. exports by the mid-19th century, fueling not only the Southern economy but the rise of the North as well, where textile mills processed raw cotton into finished goods. The ripple effect of slave labor was global. British factories ran on American cotton, and merchants from New York to Liverpool profited from every bale that left the docks of New Orleans or Charleston. Politicians and businessmen understood just how central slavery was to American prosperity, and so did those who were enslaved. The economic importance of their labor was reflected in how they were treated, as assets to be insured, traded, mortgaged, and leveraged. Enslaved people appeared in ledgers, court records, and inheritance documents. Their bodies, their skills, and even their future children were calculated into the wealth of their enslavers. The power of slavery stretched far beyond Southern plantations, shaping the American economy from top to bottom and reaching overseas. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond boldly proclaimed, "Cotton is king, and no power dares to make war upon it." Southern leaders saw cotton and the enslaved labor that produced it as the backbone of American prosperity. Economist James DeBow called the cotton crop the wonder of the age, and with good reason. Fortunes were made from this single commodity. But the wealth generated by slavery didn't stop at the Mason-Dixon line. Northern textile mills depended on Southern cotton, while banks and shipping companies across the country profited from the booming trade. Historian Eric Foner noted that the slave economy had ripple effects, with plenty of merchants profiting from the slave trade, revealing that many in the North were deeply complicit. Internationally, American cotton fueled the British textile industry, driving the Industrial Revolution. By 1860, nearly 80% of the cotton used in British factories came from the American South. As historian Sven Beckert put it, cotton, and with it slavery, became the driving force of a globally interconnected economy. The world's wealth was built, in part, on the suffering and labor of the enslaved. Whispers in the Quarters, the hidden world of enslaved culture. When the fields finally emptied and darkness fell across the plantations, a different kind of life quietly awakened in the slave quarters. In these crowded, weathered cabins, enslaved people carved out moments of comfort, meaning, and resistance far from the eyes of the overseers. Here, family and community took on new significance, offering a fragile sense of belonging in a world determined to break every bond. In the flickering light of a single lamp, elders shared stories from their African homelands, tales of distant rivers, ancestors, and legendary tricksters. These stories did more than pass the time. They preserved memories that slavery tried to erase and gave hope to new generations born in captivity. Frederick Douglass once wrote, "The slave's happiness is not the end sought by slavery. It is necessary to darken his moral vision." But within the quarters, enslaved people refused to let their spirits be extinguished. Through oral traditions, they claimed the right to remember, to dream, and to imagine a future beyond bondage. The culture that blossomed in these quarters was as diverse as the African nations from which people had been torn. Historian Ira Berlin described it as a cultural diaspora, a blend of languages, beliefs, and rituals woven together in the New World. Spiritual life was central and complex. While slaveholders often forced Christianity onto their captives, many enslaved people secretly maintained elements of their original religions, adapting them into new spiritual practices that could be hidden in plain sight. Historian Albert J. Rabateau estimates that by 1860, only about 10% of enslaved people were Christians in the traditional sense. The rest relied on faiths like Vodun, Santeria, and Conjure, African-rooted traditions that brought comfort, hope, and a sense of agency. These beliefs offered healing, protection, and a direct link to ancestors, and they persisted through secret rituals, amulets, and herbal remedies. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved writer, remembered, "There was not a man, but that believed in conjuration," a sign of how powerfully these old ways endured. Worship often happened in hidden places, brush arbors or hush harbors, where enslaved people could gather away from the master's gaze. There they could pray, sing, and mourn together, building a sense of unity and spiritual strength. Music and dance became central to this hidden world. Work songs, spirituals, and field hollers echoed across the fields, helping people coordinate their efforts, express sorrow, or signal hope. These songs were more than entertainment. As scholar Lawrence Levine noted, the spirituals are full of double meanings, including secret codes for escape or protest. Songs like "Steal Away to Jesus" or "Go Down Moses" spoke of deliverance and freedom, even as they masked their true purpose from white overseers. The ring shout, a circular dance blending African and Christian elements, became a powerful expression of community, faith, and resistance. Through rhythmic movement, clapping, and call and response vocals, participants found moments of joy, connection, and even rebellion. In cities like New Orleans, enslaved people gathered in Congo Square on Sundays to drum, dance, and sing, keeping the rhythms of their ancestors alive and building networks that reached beyond the plantation. family and kinship were the foundation of enslaved communities. Even though families could be shattered at any moment by sale or forced relocation, people worked hard to forge and maintain strong bonds. Historian Herbert Gutman called the family the most significant social unit among the enslaved. Naming practices reflected this determination. Parents often gave children African names or used surnames to declare kinship, defying a system that refused to acknowledge their ties. Historian Brenda Stevenson wrote, "Surnames provided a means to assert self and kin, a quiet yet powerful form of resistance." Claiming one's own name was sometimes a radical act. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, chose a new name after escaping slavery, a symbol of her freedom and her mission as a preacher and activist. Through names, stories, rituals, and traditions, enslaved people affirmed their humanity and their place in a world that sought to erase them. Ultimately, the hidden culture of the quarters was more than survival. It was a form of resistance. Every song sung, story shared, or ritual performed was an assertion of identity and hope. Frederick Douglass captured this spirit when he wrote, "The slave system was utterly hateful to me. I hated everything that reminded me of my condition." In the shadows, enslaved people refused to be defined only by their chains. They built beauty, meaning, and connection. And through that, they kept the dream of freedom alive, whispering hope into the darkness. Which story or moment from America's struggle with slavery surprised you the most, and why? The Unshackling, America's long march toward emancipation. By the early 19th century, America was at a crossroads, a nation with a founding promise of liberty, yet shackled by the grim reality of slavery. The battle for freedom would span generations, testing the country's conscience and resolve. It was in 1831 on the cobblestone streets of Boston that a small but determined group of reformers founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. These were some of the first organized abolitionists in the United States, and among them was William Lloyd Garrison, a fiery journalist whose words would ignite a movement. Garrison was relentless, launching his newspaper, The Liberator, with a promise that thundered through every issue. "I will be as harsh as truth. I do not wish to think with moderation." His insistence on immediate abolition, not gradual change, galvanized allies and enraged opponents, pushing the issue of slavery to the very heart of public debate. But the fight against slavery didn't begin with Garrison or Whittier. Its roots ran deeper back to the Quakers, one of the earliest religious groups to denounce slavery. In 1775, Anthony Benezet, a French immigrant and devout Quaker, founded America's first abolitionist society. As early as 1762, he wrote, "The Negroes are our fellow creatures. They have the same right to liberty that we have." These early voices planted seeds of conscience that would grow for decades. The 19th century saw the abolitionist movement catch fire, powered not only by white reformers but also by the searing testimony of Black Americans who had survived slavery themselves. Frederick Douglass, born into bondage, escaped in 1838 and became a voice that could not be ignored. His speeches and writings shattered the convenient illusions of the North and South alike. Douglass wrote of his childhood, "I have often been awakened by the shrieks of an own aunt, whom he used to tie up and whip." His vivid, unflinching accounts brought the realities of slavery to audiences who might otherwise have looked away. The abolitionists faced towering obstacles. The Southern economy, political system, and social order all depended on slave labor, and those in power were determined to protect their interests. Even some founding fathers who spoke about freedom and the evils of slavery failed to take action. Thomas Jefferson once acknowledged the moral depravity of the slave trade, writing, "The whole commerce is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions." Yet when the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 turned slavery into a profit machine, the hope for a voluntary end to the institution faded. In the South, resistance to abolition grew fierce and violent. but beneath the surface, anger and desperation simmered among the enslaved. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a bloody uprising in Virginia that left more than 50 white people dead. Turner's rebellion shattered the myth of a docile slave population and terrified the South. After Turner's capture, his lawyer Thomas R. Gray described him as a complete fanatic, or plays his part most admirably, a comment reflecting the fear, confusion, and denial many white Southerners felt. The courage of black abolitionists remained undimmed. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman risked everything for freedom and to help others achieve it. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, became both an abolitionist and a champion for women's rights. Her 1851 speech in Akron, Ohio rang out, "That man over there says, 'Nobody ever helps me, and ain't I a woman?'" Truth's words called out the hypocrisy of a society that denied both women and black people their rights. Meanwhile, the fight over slavery's future raged in Congress and on the frontier. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced Northerners to participate in the capture of runaway slaves, sparking outrage and acts of civil disobedience. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became a cultural lightning rod. Through her story, she humanized enslaved people and exposed the cruelty of their bondage, declaring, "The law of God cannot be repealed by any human enactment." Stowe's words reached across class and regional lines, pushing many to see the moral cost of complicity. As the 1850s wore on, the country lurched toward crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which left the fate of slavery up to voters in new territories, ignited violent clashes known as Bleeding Kansas. Political divisions deepened. The new Republican Party, born of anti-slavery sentiment, rallied behind slogans like "free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." Its first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, carried the banner of abolition to the national stage. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked a turning point in American history. Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the spread of slavery, alarmed the South, leading to the secession of 11 states and the eruption of the Civil War. Although the conflict began as a battle to preserve the Union, it soon became inseparable from the issue of slavery. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 declared freedom for enslaved people in the rebelling states, transforming the war into a fight for both unity and human liberty. As the war dragged on, Lincoln reflected on its heavy toll in his second inaugural address, expressing hope for peace and an end to the nation's suffering. The Civil War ultimately resulted in the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. While the war's end marked a monumental victory for freedom, it was just the beginning of a long and challenging journey toward true equality in America. A journey defined by resilience, moral courage, and an unwavering belief in human dignity. Thank you for joining me on this meaningful journey back in history. If you feel these stories have touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to Past Not Past, and share this video with your friends who also love history. Let's continue to explore other memorable stories together.